So let me welcome all of you to the Stoic Week event here in Milwaukee. This is part of International Stoic Week, which is a worldwide celebration for Stoic philosophy. It's focused mainly on how it can improve our lives. We do some things depending on where the event is on some more technical aspects of Stoicism, but the talk that I'm going to give here tonight is pretty basic. Stoic Week itself, some of you guys know, because you're members of I'm guessing in the class, right? That's running right now? No? You're just signed up for updates? Okay. Well, Stoic Week has been around, I think, for 3 or 4 years, and it got started by these guys at the University of Exeter in England, where they had a conference where they brought together academic philosophers who had an interest in Stoicism, and then practicing psychotherapists, because there's varieties of psychotherapy that were influenced originally by Stoicism, like cognitive behavior therapy, and it's been quite useful for a lot of people. So they host International Stoic Week. They're sort of the clearinghouse for all of these sorts of events. They provide online classes. The 1 week one is going on right now. There's a 4-week one on resilience and mindfulness training that they do in the summer, which is pretty cool. Have you done it? I see you're nodding over there. No? I recommend those sort of things. And they invite people worldwide to host their own events, so that's why I'm doing this event here. So this year, in addition to producing a series of 7 videos, that's sort of what I do. I did that last year. And I'm also creating an online course on Epictetus's discourse as a free online course for anybody who's interested. That'll open up in November, late November. I decided to host this event in Milwaukee. I'm going to introduce myself very briefly to you, and we can talk more later about that sort of thing. I'm Greg Sadler. I'm an academic philosopher in the traditional sense, in that I've held academic positions and continue to hold them. I do the sort of typical teaching and research and publication that you expect out of a professor. I've also been involved in a lot of academic leadership, assessment of student learning, and faculty development, because I sort of got kicked upstairs at various places that I worked. If you have a talent for that sort of thing, they will have you do it, but they won't pay you much more to do it, so they get a bargain out of it. But a lot of what I do these days has a much more popular and practical sort of emphasis to it. I do a lot of public speaking, events like this, to general and professional audiences, libraries, businesses, churches, schools, clubs, pretty much anybody who gives me an invitation to come in and give a talk. If I think it's an interesting idea, I'll come in and do that. I produce a lot of YouTube videos on philosophy. Some of you know me, I think, through that. Right now, my channel today is just passing 24,000 subscribers, which for an academic channel is pretty cool. I'm also a APPA certified philosophical counselor, so some of the practice that I engage in is helping clients to sort out, life situations and problems using resources from philosophy, mainly Stoicism and a few other traditions like Aristotelianism myself. And when I was an undergrad, are all of you undergrads or are some of you graduate students? This is the UWM contingent. Okay. So when I was an undergrad, I got exposed to Stoicism. I bet you did too. And any of you who did a college degree, you probably at one point read Epictetus's Enchiridion and then promptly forgot about it, which is what I did numerous times. And it didn't really click. It was only later on when I was doing research primarily on anger and anger management that I started to see just what was there in these Stoic texts and why it was so interesting. And so then I became sort of captivated with it. And I'm not a Stoic myself, so I do have to kind of cop to that from the beginning. I'm more of an eclectic person, like Cicero, somebody who writes a lot about the Stoics, but is not himself a Stoic. I admire the Stoics. I think there's a lot of valuable stuff to what they do, but ultimately I draw a bit more on, say, Aristotle or Plato than the Stoics. I'm more of a pragmatist in that respect. So for the talk tonight, I've got about 40 minutes of material prepared. But the way I usually do my talks is, as I'm going through stuff, if there's anything that's unclear or that you'd like to ask a question about, go right ahead and do so. We don't have to stick to a very tight schedule. I don't have everything bracketed out the way some people do when they're speaking. They'll say pause here. I don't know if you've ever seen those sorts of things. And so I'll go through the material that I've got, and then we can just have sort of open discussion or Q&A if there's anything you want to know more about, or there's comments you want to make, or you want to have other discussions. That's great. And then I figure after that we can, those of you that are interested, retire to the lounge, and I'm going to have a drink, and I invite you to join me having a drink as well. That'll be a lot of fun. So what I want to do tonight is I want to start by briefly setting out and discussing the main topic for the night, which is happiness. And then I want to talk a little bit about this school of Stoicism. It's got a long history, so I'm not going to go into great detail about this because that would be the whole lecture. You've got a handout that will have a lot more information than I'm going to provide you about some of the key figures, but I'll tell you about some of the big guys that are important in it. And then I want to talk about 4 key components of Stoic practical philosophy that are readily applicable today and that they viewed as central to living a happy life, and which I think can contribute today for us. So these are the distinction between what is and what isn't in our power. That's the first one. The second one is focusing on the core of what a human being, what a person is. The third is relationships, roles, and duties that we have. And then the fourth is this sort of theme of progress and discipline through developing new habits. Those are things that can lead us to living a happier life, at least how the Stoics conceived of it. So when you think about happiness today, there's a few questions that I'd like you to sort of just ponder, and you don't have to necessarily have responses right now, but these are, yeah.
Ask a related question. Do you think they'd be offended if we turned that screen off?
I doubt it,
It's really distracting.
Sure, if you want to ask, that'd be great. You want to just flip it on? There you go. Yeah. See, I'm not distracted by it because I don't have to look at it, right? But yeah, I suppose with the endless supply of faces. All right. So here's some sort of big questions to think about. The first one is, are you happy right now, or are you unhappy, or is it sort of a mixture of the two, where some aspects of your life make you happy and some the opposite? And then think about this as well. If you had to pick somebody, who do you consider to be living the kind of life right now that does make them happy, and what is it about that way of living that makes them happy? This leads us to deeper questions like, well, what does it actually mean to be happy? Is it a momentary state of pleasure, or is it something deeper, something stable, something long-lasting, something that could pervade a person's entire life? And then we have to ask about things like, what sort of things are needed to make us happy? What sort of conditions are required? Are they external goods? How much do we need to have in the bank in order to be happy? Does the food have to be good? Does the drink have to be good? How healthy do we need to be? These are all real practical questions. Or are there more internal things that have to do with our own happiness or unhappiness? And then, what role do we have? Is it something that we have control over, or is it primarily somebody else who's responsible? These are live questions that people ask and they answer in their life, and everybody already has an answer that they're coming to the table with. We can change our answers over time, but that usually takes a little bit for that to happen. And then here's probably the most important question. Can a person be mistaken about whether they're happy or not? Is it possible to actually miss the mark about what happiness is? Are there ways in which people tell themselves or others they're happy when they're not happy? These are all things worth mulling over before we delve into the Stoics. And now think about our culture that we live in today. It's radically different than the culture that Epictetus or Cicero or Zeno were living in. You know, we don't have slaves. I mean, there are slaves in parts of the world, but we don't have slavery here. Instead, we have, technology. As Aristotle said, once we have shuttles that can move themselves, we won't need slaves to do that sort of thing. You would think we'd be in a much happier condition given the material prosperity that we have, but it doesn't seem like people actually are particularly happy in the culture that we're in. But we are a culture that talks an awful lot about happiness and is almost obsessed with it. So think about a few examples. Think about advertising, for example. What's the whole point of advertising? It's to create desires that aren't already there, and to awaken either joy or fear or a kind of promise down the line of, if I just get this, then I'm going to be happy. Takes kids, by the way, really by surprise. I'd forgotten about this until I had my own kids, and I'd watch them watching TV and see them see something on there and get captivated by it, and then turn to me and say, "Can we get that?" And I'd say, "Well, why do you want that? Isn't that garbage?" And they'd say, "Well, I'll be happy." Well, they wouldn't say quite so straightforwardly, but they'd convey the impression that they'd be happy if they just got this, whatever it was that's being advertised. And kids shows, by the way, 22 minutes every half an hour is programming. The rest of it is advertising. And so you get a lot of stuff from breakfast cereals to toys to you name it. There's all sorts of compensatory pleasures out there in our society. I mean, just think about the street that we're on. You could walk up and down this street and just go to any place, get yourself a nice meal, sit down, absorb the atmosphere, have a beer, have a glass of wine, whatever it is that you want. And if you were feeling kind of blue, you might actually feel a little bit better. Right? There's all sorts of compensatory pleasures in our society that we have almost automatic access to. We just need a little bit of money. If you compare it to previous eras that people lived in, the stuff that we have access to is just amazing. Right? So we should be ecstatic because we've got so much great stuff. The bad part is that a lot of that is things we can become dependent on, whether it's food or drinking or sexual pleasure or even entertainment. Think about binge watching Netflix or Hulu, which I know I've done. Probably I'm willing to bet some of you have done as well. Do those things really make us happy? There's other bigger picture things too that we can talk about that we tend to associate happiness with. A fulfilling career. That's way better than a meal or a hookup or watching an entire series of something on TV. Financial security. That's something I think all desire. A nice house, or there's been jokes about the American dream has been downgraded from having a nice house to at least just having a nice car, but having some large term investment that you can sit in, that's nice. A great romantic relationship, many people pin their hopes on that, oftentimes going from relationship to relationship to relationship, or even just having a great circle of friends. Think about how people value that and will make all sorts of sacrifices in order to have that. Particularly in school is a great example of that, but the workplace that happens as well. So there's a sense in our culture of something like an imperative. We ought to be happy. And if you're not happy, what the hell is wrong with you? Look at all the opportunities you have to be happy. But not a lot of people actually are happy. You just have to walk around and talk to people, and you can find out that that's the case. So why is this? Well, what a Stoic would say is we don't get a lot of effective guidance about what really will make us happy. We need a better understanding of human nature. And if we have that, then we'll have a better understanding of what would, in fact, make us happy. So it's clear that we also live in a world where there's a lot of aspects that do make us unhappy. Think about present economic prospects. They're not as good as they were, say, 10 years ago. You guys, I'm sure, are definitely feeling that as college students, worrying about, where you're going to get a job afterwards, all those sorts of things hanging over your head. We have almost instant access to all sorts of views of human misery of all types that we didn't have 100 years ago. We had to read the newspaper to find out about how terrible things were on another continent, or about, a refugee crisis, or, some natural disaster. Now we can just get on the computer and find about that. Even just managing the day-to-day stuff, things like technology are supposed to make our lives easier. How many of you have found that it's a mixed blessing? That some of the aspects make it quite easier. Like, I can get my whole calendar on here, but all it takes is for something to go wrong on this, and I can't access anything. And now I'm sort of, lost in the lurch. I used to be able to drive around and have a paper map, and I might miss a turn somewhere, and then have to backtrack. Now I use the map on my phone. And if that map suddenly loses, I lose my signal, and now I can't figure out where I am, I have to admit I'm a little bit at a loss. And sometimes the instructions on the map don't match the signage, and I get all confused. And being myself, I usually tend to get ticked off when that happens. Now, we can ask from a Stoic perspective, what is going on with that sort of stuff? Why aren't we, again, happy? So Stoicism says that the happy life is, you can understand it in two ways. One is a sort of negative way, in terms of freedom from negative emotional responses and mistaken or false perspectives. But it's also understood in a positive way in terms of practical activity that's going to fulfill us, that's going to realize our human nature. And what they're doing is they're really refiguring the issue the way that virtue ethics does, in terms of developing good character and developing what's called moral virtue, tying ourselves in with what's intrinsically good, tying ourselves in with what's genuinely rewarding, what's going to last for a long time. It requires certain sacrifices to be made. As all of you, I think, have read some Stoic works. You mentioned you have a whole stack yet to read, but it doesn't take long to get the idea that some choices have to be made, some triage, some pruning has to take place. So all that is said by sort of way of introduction. I did want to talk about Stoicism as a philosophical movement, and then go through that really quickly. In part because I think it's useful to see the continuity with these people and how it develops over time. So Stoicism develops as what you can call a Socratic school. Socrates is not the founder of philosophy, right? There was philosophy before him that they call pre-Socratic, so we know there's a philosophy around before he comes on the scene. But he really refigures what the philosophical life is about and what the point of doing philosophy was. There's this saying that he took philosophy down from the heavens and put it on earth amongst the affairs of human beings. And the Stoics are one of the schools that is coming out of this Socratic revolution. Plato founds a school. Of course, Aristotle studies under him, founds his own school. There's also what are called these minor Socratic schools. A student of Socrates, Antisthenes, founds the Cynic school. And they place this heavy emphasis on self-reliance, on not following convention. They ended up feeding into Stoicism, because the guy who is going to start Stoicism, Zeno, studies under the Cynics, under Crates. There's also other schools that feed into that as well. The point is that Socrates and his way of living an examined life and thinking about the desires that we have and whether they're on track is giving the initial impetus to Stoicism. As a matter of fact, Zeno, this guy who starts this whole school, he winds up in Athens, and he's reading Xenophon's Memorabilia, And he asked the bookseller, is there anybody like this Socrates guy? Can I meet somebody like this? Because obviously Socrates is long dead. And the guy points out the window, because Crates is out there, and he says, well, that guy. Why don't you go study with him? So it's Socrates' example that is an initial spur for this. Zeno himself, founds a new school. And at first they're called Zenonians. So, if that had stuck, it wouldn't be Stoic week, it would be Zenonian week. Eventually they become the men of the Stoa, the men of the porch. And so it becomes the Stoic school, and we get that from then on. And the first few years of it, there's a lot of divergence, you could say. We teach it as there's Zeno, and then there's Cleanthes, the boxer, who basically just consolidates things, and then there's Chrysippus, the second founder of the school, in essence, who writes tons and tons of literature, none of which we possess, unfortunately. But actually, there were a lot of students of Zeno, and many of them were, pretty erudite, and what would we say? They were better talkers than Cleanthes was. Cleanthes was, sort of a rocky type in many respects, rather taciturn. He was just good at conserving what Zeno had passed on. All these other branches die off. As a matter of fact, one of them is associated with this guy called Diogenes the Renegade, because towards the end of his life he has a painful ailment and decides that this whole Stoic stuff about pain not really being an evil, he was wrong about that, so he's a renegade to the school. So things get sort of channeled down, and they start to take on a very definite form. That was the early Stoa, and then we get the middle Stoa. Again, everything they've written, we've lost, except in how it's been preserved with people like Cicero. So we don't really have their texts. And they're much more experimental types. They're interested in seeing how can Stoicism work but also incorporate the insights of these other schools, like the Aristotelians. Maybe they're right about certain things, like friendship, or how much goods we actually need. And then we get the late Stoa, which is primarily Roman. And this is the stuff we actually do have. Here we're talking about Seneca, we're talking about Epictetus, and we're talking about Marcus Aurelius. There are a few other texts. Musonius Rufus is from that era, but most of the stuff that was written at that time, unfortunately, again, we don't have. One of the things you find out if you start doing a lot of research in ancient philosophy is most of it we simply don't have access to. We have lists of catalogs of what was written, tantalizing titles, and then all of it's gone. We have reports that, for instance, Chrysippus wrote something like 700 scrolls of material, none of which we possess. It'd be kind of cool to know what's in there, but we don't actually need that so much, because from Cicero and from Seneca and Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, we get a lot of coherent doctrine from what they were teaching. So those are the classic Stoics. Stoicism ends up having a great influence on Christian thought and being sort of absorbed into the early Christian fathers' ideas. You look at somebody like John Cassian and the whole monastic movement. There's a heavy Stoic influence there. But Stoicism as a school eventually dies out. It gets resuscitated again in the Renaissance, in part because they're just rediscovering these ancient texts, and they're also taking Epictetus's writings, which had been rather Christianized. There were additions that were put in there, and they kind of came up with a critical edition. And then people started identifying as Stoics again. And this is what we call Neo-Stoicism. And that, exercised a great influence. Descartes is, in many respects, picking up on Stoic themes. Pascal is writing about why the Stoics are so wrong. David Hume talks about the Stoics. Frederick the Great, the military leader, used to carry around an Epictetus Enchiridion and read it every so often. He said he was a great admirer of that. It's because of him that Admiral Stockdale, who I think some of you may have read at one time or another, himself, read Epictetus and then used that when he was caught in a Vietnamese prison camp. In the 20th century, well, let me back up a little bit. In the 19th century, it was kind of popular in the history of ideas to say, Plato and Aristotle, that's where philosophy really was in the ancient period. The other stuff, the Hellenistic stuff, the Epicureans, the Stoics, the Skeptics, that was all kind of a decline. It's not quite so, it's not first quality stuff. It's what happens when, the Greek city-states are gone and we have these universal empires and people are just concerned about themselves. And that's actually a misreading. We found that out in the 20th century through better scholarship on Stoicism. And also through the rediscovery of something that maybe some of you have been exposed to, this philosophy as a way of life approach to looking at texts. And this is actually something I think that is very important. A lot of philosophy was not meant to become the exclusive domain of academics. It was supposed to be something that the ordinary educated person out there who didn't require a philosophy degree could make sense of and use to improve their life. Descartes' Meditations is a great example of that. A lot of Hume's essays are examples of that. Things took, we can talk about this more if you want to later on. Things took weird twists in the 19th and 20th century through the professionalization of philosophy. Stoicism did have a very strong academic wing to it in its heyday, but it was clearly meant to be something that would fit into a person's life, that would inform the way that they were living, the choices that they were making. And you can say the same thing about pretty much all the great philosophies. You can say the same thing about Plato. You can say the same thing about Aristotle. Aristotle actually tells you this in the Nicomachean Ethics. It's not about reading the book, it's about applying it. And if you're not applying it, you're not reading the book right, he says at one point. So in the 21st century, and this is sort of an example of this, because of what the internet has afforded to us, Stoicism is going through a new renaissance. So, Stoic Week, right? People show up to some place in downtown Milwaukee because somewhere out there in the ether we sent some information and somehow it got to you. And, pretty strange, isn't it? This wouldn't have been possible 20 years ago. So I don't really know where it's going to go from here, but I'm very happy to see the revival of interest in these great thinkers. So now what I'd like to do is to talk a little bit about these different components. I created a handout that has some reading selections mainly from Epictetus's discourses, a few from the Enchiridion. It's that one right there. There you go. And you don't have to read through it right now, but it's just those are the key themes that I wanted to hit on. These are things that I think Stoicism is particularly strong in teaching us how we can be happy. Stoicism has a lot to offer. Again, I'm not a Stoic myself. I'm just somebody who thinks that there's a lot of high quality available to us in its approach. So one of the key things, you see this as soon as you start reading Epictetus, is this distinction between what is in our power and what is not in our power. You don't have to be a Stoic, by the way, to make that distinction. There's other schools that do as well, but the Stoics have a particular take on it that I think is very interesting. The Greek, by the way, for that, it's translated as what is in our power and what's not in our power, what's in our control or what's not in our control. And that's true. That's a decent translation. But another way you could translate it is what is up to us. Or what's our business. The Greek is just epi to humon, and that's the negative of that. So when you're telling somebody that's none of your business, you're in effect saying that's not in your power in the way that Epictetus is talking about it. I remember my grandmother, my family's French-Canadian, and my grandmother and grandfather would mostly speak French. And my grandfather was a very gregarious person who would get in everybody's business and wanted to know about everything and had opinions about everything. And my grandmother was much more retiring, and she would always say pas ton affaire, meaning that's not your business, it's not your affair. She'd be constantly, she was sort of like, I guess his stoic conscience, right? And he would get quite upset about things that really were none of his business. So she would have been in effect carrying out a good function. So what is up to us? For the Stoics, it's the internal. It's the choices that we make. It's our personality. It's what we think or how we feel. And even more importantly, what we desire and what we are averse to, what we pursue, what we turn away from. Everything else, the Stoics say, is really not up to us, even though we think that it is. For example, I got up and I put on this jacket at some point in the day, and this is my jacket. I don't have my name written inside or anything like that, but it doesn't belong to anybody else. But, from a Stoic perspective, it's not really mine. It's not who I am. And if this jacket gets ruined, should I allow that to affect me or not? Even think about my body. If I lose a hand, we would tend to get upset about that. I know I still would myself, and this is one respect in which I'm probably never going to be a Stoic. But strictly speaking, this is not me. What's me is the choices that I make. If I lose a hand, how do I view that? How do I react to it? That is up to me. But whether I lose the hand or not isn't. So he talks about body, reputation, success, positions, honors. Why are these not up to us? Because other factors determine that. There are all sorts of processes going on in the world that we don't actually have control over. So, I have some degree of control. Just to take a sort of silly example, if I walk out into traffic here, what's going to happen to me? Somebody's going to hit me. Because somebody's not going to be looking, probably because they'll be texting or something like that. Or they say, screw that guy, I'm going to get him. That's because they chose that. That's because those mechanistic processes are happening. It's not up to me. If I walk out into traffic, I can be pretty confident about what's likely to happen. Right? It's not as if things are totally up in the air. But I could, if I decided I want to get hit, I could walk out and nobody could hit me. I could be unsuccessful in that sort of thing. These things are not up to us. Particularly the things that are actually up to other people. We're not going to do well if we make those things really central to our happiness. So, for example, whether I'm liked or not. I have some degree of control over that, right? I can create what we might say necessary conditions for being liked, but I can't create the sufficient conditions. I can, think about Facebook, right? We're connected through Facebook. I can treat you like a jerk on Facebook, in which case you're probably not going to like me, right? I can be very condescending. Well, if you want to come to the event, I suppose that would be okay. You wouldn't like that, would you? So, but not doing that and actually saying nice things, that's not enough to actually make somebody else like you. You don't control their feelings. So if we want to be happy, the Stoics say, we have to confine ourselves to what it is that we actually do have control over. And if we don't, we're really setting ourselves up for being unhappy. If we are going to place our good in getting the next position or in becoming famous. There's a lot of ways to become famous these days, many more than there used to be now that we have the internet, but still, once you become famous, you have control over almost nothing. We're not going to be happy. And this extends even to things like romantic relationships or friendships. We don't control how other people view us, value us, behave towards us. There are some objections that we can make to this, and I gave you some of those on the handout about that. We do have some degree of control over some things. Can we really say we don't have any control over our bodies? That's not quite true. I can choose whether I exercise. I can choose whether I drink tainted water. I can choose whether I eat well or eat poorly. But in the end, if the bus is going to hit me, the bus is going to hit me. In the end, if I've got the bad genes for cancer and things happen to align the right way, I'm getting the cancer. There's not much I can do about all of those things in the long run. I can sort of hedge my bets, but that's the best that it gets. Same thing with respect to skills or talents. Do any of you play musical instruments? No? Okay. What do you play?
A little bit, piano.
Okay, well that's a great instrument because you can do music theory with that. So when you play, you can cultivate your talent. I actually play the banjo. I don't play the sort of music you're supposed to play on the banjo, bluegrass and stuff like that, or old-timey. I do play a little bit of old-timey, but I mostly play rock music that I find the guitar tablature for, and I don't put in the practice time to actually get good. So when I play, my kids are not usually that happy about me playing and singing because it doesn't sound great. Now, if I wanted to sound really good, what could I do? Practice an hour a day. That's sort of like the guideline, right? You want to get good at a musical instrument, an hour a day. You want to get really good, try 5. If you want to invest that sort of time. Now, you can become a virtuoso and put on a performance, and everybody can hate it. You don't have any control over the reception. You can be the person who specializes in this piece by Prokofiev, and you play it better than anybody else in the world ever has done, even better than Prokofiev ever imagined somebody could, and nobody wants to hear it. That's a live possibility. So there are a lot of things that are partially in our control, but not really in our control. And we want to withdraw ourselves from those sorts of things. How do we withdraw ourselves? Well, that's the second point. What is really at our core? Who are we? In order to pursue happiness in the Stoic way, you have to understand what a human being fundamentally is. And for Epictetus, he has 2 ways of talking about this that really are the same thing. He talks about the faculty of choice, or what in Greek we call proiresis. And proiresis, it's a difficult term to translate. It's translated sometimes as moral purpose, when you see keeping your moral purpose in accordance with nature in certain translations. Literally, hairein in Greek means to reach out and grab. And proiresis means to take one thing instead of another. So when we talk about setting priorities, that's proiresis. So when you have prioritized what's important in your life and excluded other things, you have engaged in proiresis. And every one of us has that. And the way that we are as human beings is the product of the choices that we've made about that sort of stuff, about the stuff that really matters. Another way of talking about this is the ruling faculty or the rational faculty. Because for the Stoics, the 2 of these are 2 sides of the same coin. Our faculty of choice or faculty of will is in fact the same thing by which we're able to think things out, able to reason. As a matter of fact, one of the implications of this is that insofar as we're not wise yet, and I'm not, I don't know if any of you are the Stoic wise man, but I mean, if you are, that's great. You should be up here, and why should I be talking then? Insofar as we're not that guy, we're not fully rational. We begin mostly irrational with a bit of rationality, and rationality is something that we cultivate over time. It's something that we can increase. It's something that we can build upon. It's not something that's an on-off switch. Either you're rational or you're irrational. As a matter of fact, when I was thinking about this, I'll come to that. I have a nice metaphor for this later. There's also another important factor to this part. It's reflexive in the sense that it bears upon itself. So in the selection that I gave you, Epictetus says there's only one faculty that actually works upon itself. The musical faculty, whatever that means, our capacity to play music, that doesn't actually tell us whether we should play music or not. It just tells us if we're supposed to play music, this is how you do it. The part of us that actually decides for ourselves what we ought to do, what would be best for us to do, how we ought to live, that's that rational faculty. And we have a choice to make, a fundamental choice. Do we ourselves set the agenda? Do we decide how it's going to be structured, or do we let other stuff decide? Because we don't get any other options. Either we're going to decide it, or somebody or something else is going to decide it. And you can say, well, I'll just do whatever I want. Well, that's actually letting other stuff decide. If you just think you're going to go walk through life and just pursue whatever comes up, that's allowing those things to tell you what to do and what to be. And if you do that, you're not going to be very happy because, again, those are things out of your control, and then you're going to end up being disappointed, and things are not going to go well. So the other two themes that I wanted to talk about very briefly, you might get the idea from this that to be a Stoic then means to say, all right, I got to back up and cut off all my connections with everybody. Friends, family, they're just trouble. I got to stay away from them. Coworkers, forget them. I'm not going out after work with those. I'm not going to a birthday party. That could be an occasion where I might be generating unhappiness for myself. What if I care about whether the person likes their gift? Oh my goodness, I'm making myself miserable. So you might get the impression that the Stoic life means a withdrawal like that. But that actually isn't the way Epictetus at least portrays it. Really, none of the other Stoics do. He says we have duties. We have duties that are befitting to us, and we can figure out what those are by looking at the roles that we have or the relationships that we have. Now, some relationships we don't choose at all. We're stuck with those, like being somebody's kid, right? By the time that you're born, you're somebody's kid, and that's it. And Epictetus says, you don't get to choose whether you have a good father or a bad father. It's not up to you at all. And no matter how much you get on his case, if he's a bad dad, he's going to be a bad dad. There's nothing you can do about that. You can just figure out how you're going to react to it. But should you have a kid, you do get to decide whether you're going to be a good dad or a bad dad. That's up to you. You also have a choice, even if your dad is not the best guy in the world, how you behave as a child towards your parent. And likewise with brothers and sisters. I suppose if in your family you have obligations like I do to my cousins, because it's a big close-knit family, then you have quite a few of those sort of things. Maybe some of you don't have those, which can be actually very freeing. But you get the idea. Then there's all sorts of other roles that we have in relation to each other as well. Like I have roles in relation to my students. I have certain responsibilities, like grading their work fairly, not playing favorites, right? If I want to be a good teacher, I actually have to do that. That's a requirement for me. So if I'm going to have my proairesis, my rational faculty, as Epictetus would say, in accordance with nature, I have to choose to be a good teacher. I have to choose, I have a wife, so I have to choose whether I'm going to be a good husband or not. I have kids, so I have to decide whether I'm going to be a good father or not. I have neighbors. There's one we can all relate to, right? There's good neighbors and there's bad neighbors. Should I play my music as loud as I want, whenever I want? Probably not, right? If I do, I probably will be unhappy because people are going to be banging on the wall and I'm not going to like that, or they're going to give me dirty looks in the hall. The Stoic is not going to do that sort of thing. The Stoic is going to do the right thing regardless of how other people behave, in part because that's liberating, that's freeing. By doing the right thing, at first you have to kind of force yourself, if you're like me, to do the right thing, frankly. But after you do it long enough, it becomes habit, and you take a pleasure in it. You enjoy it. And not a pleasure like a physical pleasure like you get with eating or drinking, but a sort of deeper satisfaction. That's what's available. That's an important component of happiness. And that doesn't depend on anybody else. The last thing that I want to hit on is this notion of progress or discipline. Living like a Stoic, here's the metaphor I'd like to give you, is not like an on-off switch, right? So if you read Epictetus, you're like, wow, this is great, brilliant stuff. My whole life has been a mess up until now. Now I'm going to be a Stoic. Turn it on. Have any of you tried that? I know I have tried stuff like that in the past. Never sticks, right? You make a resolution, usually at New Year's or after a breakup. My life is going to be totally different. I'm going to get it all together. And then suddenly it doesn't get together. Why not? Well, because you already have habits. You already have a whole bunch of ways in which your proeresis, or your rational faculty, is structured. It's already out of whack. It's sort of like you're trying to take a car that's got a whole bunch of things wrong with it and throw it onto the speedway immediately and say you're going to win the race. You can't do that. You have to start tuning it up. You have to start working on this part and this part and this part. And it may take a lot of labor. And it may take a lot of time, which means that you have to keep choosing over and over and over again. So it's not like an on-off switch, but it's also not like a dimmer switch. It's not like you just, well, a little bit of Stoicism today, a little bit more tomorrow, let's turn it up, and eventually we'll get the lights all the way up. No, think about it as being sort of a whole battery of switches. And you got to flip them one at a time. And it takes you a while to do it. And while you're flipping the switches, some of the ones back here that you flipped, they flip back. And now you got to go back and do that. Epictetus talks about this in terms of anger. He says, if you let yourself lose your temper, you're making your habit of being angry worse. And every time that you do it, you make yourself a little bit tougher you make it tougher for yourself the next time. Because you're going to, slip slowly into these adjustments. Well, that guy had it coming. Or I'm really not that angry right now compared to how I used to be. You're going to make all these sorts of excuses for yourself that are going to be counterproductive. And then he says, instead, take each opportunity to, if you can't help being angry, just don't act on it. Or try to, get rid of it. And then eventually, when you start getting to the point where things happen and you don't get ticked off, start keeping track of that. If you make it through a day, say, wow, that's incredible. When you made it through a couple months, then sacrifice to God. Now, I've actually been trying to do this. This is one of the aspects of Stoicism I've been trying to practice. I've never made it through more than a couple days without losing my temper about one thing or another, whether it's technology or traffic or something somebody said, or the dogs when I'm walking them and they're not cooperating. Imagine trying to do that for month after month after month. Well, that's flipping those switches. But if you want to change your drives, your desires, your aversions, that is something that's possible for us as human beings. It takes a lot of work. And if we do that, the Stoic promise is that is what it will take for us to really be happy. So it's pretty arduous, but it is something within the realm of possibility. Now here's the good news about it, and I'll sort of close with that. If you look at the far off thing about oh my gosh, how am I ever going to get there and have my habits like totally aligned properly so I become the Stoic wise man? Well, you probably will get so discouraged you won't do anything, right? But if you start doing some of it and you make some progress, you're going to be happier than when you started out. Maybe happiness is not about getting to that final destination that some people do make it to, I think, but I'm not sure I'm ever going to. And maybe it's more about getting somewhere along there where some of the switches are flipped the way they need to be and some of the lights are on. So that's all I have to say as far as prepared remarks. So now is a good time for any sort of questions, or we can have a general discussion if you like. Anything you want to talk about Stoicism-wise? I mean, let me ask you this. What do you guys think? Does this make sense to you? There's a way to become happier? Or some of it you think, that sounds like nonsense?
Well, it's not even necessarily happiness, it's just sanity.
Yeah. You mean like not doing sanity in the sense of not being compelled to do crazy things that afterwards you say, why the hell did I do that?
Well, yeah, I'm in management a lot of times, emotions and whatnot.
Oh, yeah.
I always try to take emotions out of the decision, but you look people that are all cranked up and wound up, and it's just, at least you don't want to get sucked into that.
Yeah. How successful? I mean, let me ask you this. I don't mean, if you don't want to be put on the spot, I won't put you on the spot about this. But so you get craziness going on. Like, you get two employees that aren't agreeing with each other, right? They've got some sort of beef with each other. Some of it's personal. Some of it actually has some sort of merit to it. You don't, of course, don't want to get affected by that. But then how do you get them to recognize that what they're doing is irrational?
Well, typically from the beginning, when they're cranked up, you don't affect the reason it doesn't work.
Yeah.
I mean, at that point, you kind of split and wait a day or two, and once their emotions are down, then you can try to talk rational to somebody.
Yeah.
If you're cranked up, you might as well beat your head against the wall.
Yeah. When it comes to anger, there's a lot of discussions in ancient philosophy, because they had a lot of problems with that back then, just like we do now, about how to deal with it. And some philosophers had the idea that, look, once you're angry, you can't reason with a person. Other philosophers said that's exactly when you want to get people to work on their anger management stuff, because look, they're in the situation. It's sort of like, if you want to practice your skating for hockey, you can practice what it's like to actually, you can do drills and stuff like that, But if you want to know what it's like to be in a game, you got to do it in a game. You got to scrimmage.
I would think you have to have that mindset before you get angry.
Yes,
And
that's the
okay, that was perfect time.
Yeah.
You don't hit it with it right then, because they're too wound up,
Yeah, see, my own view is that you're very unlikely to get anywhere with anybody when they're angry, because I know it doesn't even work with me when I'm trying to reason with myself when I'm angry,
Well, yeah, again, it's like, if you're going to be human, you're not going to be rational, and you're just not. And, we've all probably been in spots where you go, I know this is the right thing to do, but screw it, I'm not going to do it.
Yeah.
Even though rationally I know it is.
Yeah.
That's part of being a human being.
Yeah, or the flip side, where we say, boy, I know this is the wrong thing, but it's awfully tempting. Yeah, this is going to be fun.
Yep.
I'm going to regret this tomorrow, but tonight's tonight.
Yep.
Yeah.
It happens all the time.
Yeah, I mean, I guess for the Stoics, they would say, don't do things you're going to regret later. The whole goal is to free yourself of these negative affects, which really do drag us down. Regret.
But sometimes, how do you know?
How do you know whether they drag us down? Or?
No. How do you know you're
Oh.
going to How do you know? For sure. Some things, okay, you drink too much, you're going to be hungover. But,
Yeah.
you weigh probabilities a lot of times.
That's true. And as we get older, we get better, because we acquire experience. The best thing to do, of course, is to learn from other people's mistakes rather than our own. But yeah, we acquire experience, and then we can come to better probabilities about what's likely to happen. Any other comments or questions? Yeah.
You were talking about habits and flipping switches.
Oh, yeah, with the metaphor, yeah.
Yeah, and it reminds me of a really popular book recently, The Habit Factor.
Okay.
With that at all?
A little bit. I've sort of like the bullet point version,
Yeah, I'm sort of wondering how that relates to Stoicism and irrational faculties. They talk a lot about how motivation and enthusiasm and passion and everything don't get you anywhere.
Yeah.
It's all about the habits that you develop based on your long-term goals.
Yeah, so I guess the easy way to answer that is that what the Stoics are onto and what they've formulated is stuff that other people are constantly rediscovering because it's true. So you wouldn't need to read Epictetus to get this. You could get it in other ways too. There's also other philosophers like Aristotle who also really stress how important habit is as well. I tend to think that way of looking at it is right, that people talk about you got to be passionate about stuff. Passion only gets you so far, and then it runs out. And then what's going to see you through? It's laying down some sort of habits. That takes a lot more work, which is why I think a lot of people don't want to do it. They would much rather, come up with what are those boards that people put, like wish boards or vision boards? They'd rather do that, or they'd rather feel something. And if you want reliable performance for yourself, you have to generate a habit. Otherwise, that's the closest thing to reliability we have. It makes it easy for us to make the right choices once we have a habit. The bad part is it's really hard to do. So, especially when you have bad habits getting in the way, because you don't feel like doing it. And it is like flipping the switch, because each switch is a choice that you make. So if you choose, think about when we make New Year's resolutions. Okay, I'm going to quit watching more than one show at a time, right? I do that day. Then the next day I'm tempted to watch a show on Netflix, and I'm like, well, I just let it run and I'll watch the next show. I have to make that choice again, and then I have to make that choice again, and I have to keep on doing it, or else I'm not going to generate the new habit. After I've done it for a while, now it's a lot easier. It becomes, as Aristotle says, second nature. But that first 30 days,
But it seems like it's important to have something as a basis for making that choice every day. Why are you doing that? What is the benefit of it? Something to remind yourself of each time.
like a reward, you mean, or?
No, your reason for doing it. Like, why would you care whether you like running the show or not?
Yeah, and so if it's
not substantial.
So I have to remind myself then of things like, well, my time is valuable, and I want to use it, say, reading more, And, well, why does that matter? Ultimately, for the Stoic, it's going to come back to this question of, I want to live a freer, happier life. That's sort of like the very end piece. But you got to go through a couple whys to get to that point, I think. And those are what the Stoics, if we get a little technical, those are what the Stoics called duties. In Greek, kathekon, and in Latin, officium. Those are things that are not directly connected to the free life, the good life, but they lead into it. So sort of like, I don't have to be a good son-in-law to my wife's dad. Nobody's forcing me to be that, right? I could say, screw that guy, I won't, of course, because he's a nice guy. But could I live something like the Stoic life and also not be good to my father-in-law? Probably not, because it would eventually have consequences down the line that would have to do with that freedom of mine. I would have to ask, why aren't I good to him? Well, because I like being a jerk. I like doing my own thing. I don't like having somebody else telling me what to do or things like that. Well, all of that's going to affect my faculty of choice and how it's situated, and I'm not going to be really truly free. But telling myself that when I'm tempted to be a jerk, and I'm not. Unfortunately, I'm not tempted to be a jerk to him. There's other people who I am tempted to be a jerk to, where that's, I suppose, more of a factor. But telling myself if I want to actually, live a happy life, I have to make this choice now. That could see me through it, and then see me through it the next time and the next time. I suppose there could be other ways to do it too, But most of them don't really work. Like when somebody tries to pay you to change your habits. Have any of you ever participated in experiments where they pay you? Any of you guys done this? They like experimenting on students. And you guys never have any money, so,
Yeah, well, I guess it's not really, it wasn't like a life habit thing, but just like subtly how payment can affect decisions. Like,
Yeah.
I was in a study where you just had to decide which of two shapes was larger, and for the first half it was objective, and then for the second half they said whenever you answered the right shape was larger, you'd get 5 cents.
Oh.
So you do it like 100 times to see, like, even if you seem to be trying to be objective, like, would it still subtly affect your reasoning?
And then afterwards, once they're no longer paying you couldn't care less about shapes, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing. When we pay people to be good, it works so long as we keep paying them. Same thing works for penalties too. So long as we make people fear penalties, that'll work for a while, but it won't really generate those kind of liberating habits that we want in order to be happy. And so I mean, think about how this works in personal relationships. You can't nag a person or coerce a person into becoming a better person. And so many people try to do that. And it's bad for both sides, because who likes being nagged? I know I don't like it. I don't like people bringing pressure to bear on me. It's also terrible for that other person, because they're going to be miserable all the time because they can't get me to do what it is that they want me to do consistently. As soon as they back off, I'm back to doing whatever it is that I want to do. So from a Stoic perspective, it's a lose-lose situation doing that sort of thing. I don't. This is a very long-winded answer to your question, but.
Well, no, that's interesting. I just kind of wanted to open that train of thought.
How about habit?
How Stoicism might relate to this self-help movement about creating habits.
Yeah.
All else.
I mean, like I mentioned, Stoicism provided the basis for some forms of psychotherapy. They tend to be the ones that are not very new agey or, let's all be nice to each other now. They're more kind of hard-nosed. Like, have you ever done cognitive behavior therapy? Yeah, it's not. Yeah. That whole family, when you try to tell somebody, well, I'm doing things. No, look at your thoughts, take responsibility for them, make a decision whether you want to change them. There's not a lot of, what would you call it? There's not a lot of soft sell in that whole family of therapeutic stuff. But it is self-help. It's one of the original self-helps. I mean, that's what's great about Stoicism. That's what's great about Aristotle. That's what's great about Plato. All of this stuff was designed to help people make sense out of their screwed up lives and help them live a bit better. Same thing with Epicureanism, too, by the way, who the Stoics generally hated. But the Epicureans were good with that.
That's what John Peterson said 40 years ago, was reading Albert Ellis.
Yeah. Yeah. And what else is interesting, too, is it's effective. Well, I mean, studies have shown, Yeah.
This works.
Yeah.
What happens with it, because I was thinking about Albert Ellis, he used to write songs, sarcastic songs, singing in workshops. He had one song about raising up so these. That he wanted his customer or a window shopper.
Yeah.
He said most people are window shoppers. They're too lazy to make the changes that need to happen.
Epictetus actually talks about that sort of thing in terms of going to his lectures, right? Because Epictetus never wrote anything down. So it's this guy Arian who wrote down Epictetus' discourses. And Epictetus talks about people who come to the lectures and they don't do anything. But then he also talks about people who read Chrysippus. Because Chrysippus had, those 700 scrolls. So you could go and get yourself some Chrysippus, and you could spend a lot of time reading this stuff, and reading it, and talking about it with people, and never doing any of it. And Epictetus just lays into people like that, saying, what's the point in that? You're not actually improving your life at all. You're becoming a great expositor of Chrysippus, but you can't actually do anything that he's talking about. So yeah, I would suspect Ellis probably got that in part from, Epictetus, don't you think? I mean, he wasn't just reading the Enchiridion, he was reading Epictetus' discourses. So,
I know Ellis's first book was, started every chapter first had a line, sentence.
yeah.
So he obviously do that.
It is a really countercultural idea in many areas of our culture to say that a person is responsible for what they think and what they feel. There's a lot of areas in which that'll really upset people to say that to them, because if you're responsible for how you feel, then the other person isn't necessarily. I mean, the other person could still be a jerk and be at fault and all that. They shouldn't behave the way they do, but you don't get to totally displace it onto them, and you have to take some responsibility for it. But it's so liberating once you decide that that's the case, and you actually do get to decide that that's the case. Then you can choose how you want to reconfigure your thoughts and your feelings. You don't have to be miserable. You don't have to be stuck in crappy relationships.
They don't talk about, I don't see a lot in what I read where they talk about, how to. I mean, you can...
The Stoics, you mean, or?
Yes. I mean, you can get into habits like, okay, I need to go to the gym. I know how to do that. But if you say, you shouldn't be angry in this situation, or I should be indifferent to all things that I can't control.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure everybody's had experiences where rationally I think this.
Yeah.
My emotions are going, nope. I'm not
Yeah.
buying it.
You have to sort of prepare the ground beforehand, like you were saying. You will find stuff in Epictetus' discourses, some really practical advice about particularly anger. That's the stuff where I look the most. Won't apply to every single situation, but there's some pretty good stuff in there about how to manage it. Another person who has quite a bit of how-to stuff in his works is Seneca, but it's kind of piecemeal, he tended to write dealing with particular issues or problems. Like he's got to work on anger. A lot of good stuff in there. He has other works on other topics as well. So some of it, I mean, it's kind of a good issue to bring up, though, because we face new situations, too. Again, like, when the technology fails us, how do we react to that? It's not quite I mean, frankly, I treat the technology as if it was a person and do stupid things like getting angry at it and swearing at it. And thankfully, I don't hold a grudge against it the way that I've done with people in the past. I don't go that far. I'm sure there's... Yeah, well, I don't do that because I had to pay for that. So I do at least preserve that amount of rationality, knowing that if I throw it, although it's got a very strong case, so I suppose I could get away with that. I didn't think of that. I shouldn't actually start throwing it, but if I wanted to, I suppose I could. Yeah, but I mean, we do face, I think, some new challenges that the ancient Stoics didn't talk about, and that's why, the modern Stoicism movement is useful. The guys who put together the blog, they write about new situations that we face today. Yeah, there's probably a lot of stuff in our culture. You students be ticked off about student loans, and where the money is going to come from later on to pay for this stuff. I know a lot of students are very ticked off about that, and if I were in your shoes, I would be too. That's not something that Seneca or Epictetus directly talked about, but I think some of the techniques could be useful for that. I don't know, are you guys ticked off about that, or you're already okay with it?
It's just normalized, it's just...
It's the new normal,
Yeah,
as they call it?
I don't know what to be angry about, because I don't know.
It's hard to know who to be angry at. That's for sure. You know, the person who disperses the loans. You know, the professors. Trust me, the money's not going to the professors. By the way, I don't know if UWM uses a lot of adjuncts, but adjuncts are paid very poorly. The money. The reason why your education costs so much is a total, side note, but the reason why your education costs so much is because over the last 20 years, schools have essentially wasted a lot of money rebuilding buildings and trying to compete with each other about that, hiring administrators at highly inflated salaries, and then hiring all sorts of staff for them. The average wage for professors has gone way down, in part because of the proliferation of relying on adjuncts who have no benefits in most places, get paid very little per class, and now schools are kind of stuck because all the money's been wasted and they're not going to get any more. So, see, that's stuff that we could get very upset about,
How do you control?
We don't. The time to control it was a decade ago, and unfortunately, there were a few, canaries in the coal mines, but nobody paid attention to them. So, nobody who actually made decisions. Some of us were complaining about it, but yeah.
How does Stoic handle political discussion?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah. So one thing to say about the Stoics is they did stress that we should be involved in the life of our country, right? So we don't withdraw. Like the Epicureans, they said, that sort of stuff is going to drive you nuts. Just withdraw to the garden. Don't get involved with politics at all. The Stoics said, no, you should actually be involved. So a good Stoic would probably be involved in local politics, like caring about what's happening in their neighborhood, but also even caring about the national level. Now, at the national level, I don't know how you guys feel about it, but I often have a very difficult time finding a party and a candidate that I can agree with on more than half of stuff. And so it's rather dismaying, and I also don't want to not cast a vote because, I'm not sending any message by doing that. But it's rather difficult to figure out who to vote for. And that's,
They're still driven by emotion.
Oh, well, we can't. So here's the good part about that. If we're Stoics, we can't control how other people are driven by emotion. All we can do is control whether we are. So, we wouldn't watch the attack ads probably, and we wouldn't worry about all the sort of mean things they're saying about each other. But how would we talk about it at Thanksgiving? At the dinner table when Uncle so-and-so or Aunt so-and-so starts spouting off about this guy or that guy or,
When I was still working.
Oh, at the workplace too, yeah.
The group I ate lunch with, it was like 4 to 6 people, but we were pretty evenly divided.
Yeah?
2 liberals, 2 conservatives, and 2 guys that were kind of in the middle. We discussed politics every night at supper, but basically we got to where we could just pretty aggressively disagree with each other, but then still get along and go out and have a beer after work.
So,
whereas it doesn't seem like the national political discussion is like that at all. These guys that are polarizing, they don't even talk to each other.
So what made that possible for you guys to actually continue to respect each other?
Well, I think that's because we started with respecting each other. Probably, I would say, before the conversation even started.
Okay.
Well, I would imagine you know each other. You're not demonizing each other.
No, but we obviously totally disagree with each other's opinions and how things ought to be going and whatever the current situation was. But we had to get along in the work situation once you got done with lunch.
One of the things that Epictetus says is useful there, he talks about what's rational or irrational. People will do things, say things that are actually irrational, but they seem rational to them because they haven't made it quite as far along in development, right? And so we are rational animals in that we can't not have some sort of structure to what we're doing, but it can be a really screwed up one. And it can even be one that's like off on certain respects that we don't want to consider. These are the issues that we just will not back down on. And so Epictetus says, well, that's not your business how the other guy sees it. And as a matter of fact, you can avoid getting angry at him if you realize that he's not saying the things that he is or doing the things that he is because he just wants to get you or hates you or something like that. It seems rational to him to say the sort of things that he's saying. He talks about that mostly in family contexts, like why your brother is still angry at you, even though you've already said you're sorry to him. He's got an example like that in there. But it could apply to political discussions as well. I think there's a lot of people sort of taking the stances that they do because of where they come from or identifying with their class interest or things like that. And I think we can understand that fairly easily.
Or they figure they're constantly campaigning, so
yeah.
when I say this, I'm going to track this would be it's behind.
Yeah.
To some degree.
One of the things, there are some people who just like to stir things up too. I guess if you were a Stoic, you would try to just steer clear of those people as much as you can.
Yeah, one guy at work, he actually did a little sketched out emoji of himself stirring a stew pot. That was
Oh wow,
for him.
That's funny.
They were always getting on him for stirring the pot.
Yeah.
So.
It's a lot of effort to go to.
Yeah.
You know?
He'd leave these Post-its around all over the place. I was here.
Kind of reminds me of, remember Mr. Yuck? That we'd see on the poison things? Maybe we need something like that. Could put it on somebody's cubicle, Or it could, whenever they send an email, it could like come up in the corner of their email, and then you'd be warned. Watch out for this guy. Yeah. Well, I think it's a good time to come to a close, unless you have any other things you want to talk about. I'd like to thank all of you for showing up on a Thursday night down here in the city. Glad to get to know you, and I'm going to have a drink afterwards. So any of you are welcome to join me, and we can chat more, get to know each other a bit more, talk about Stoicism or other stuff. So, thanks.
Thank you.